You're listening to Into the Mystery. Is the world we experience even real? Today, Adi and I will consider the concept of Maya, a Vedantic term which means illusion. We hope you enjoy.
You were mentioning earlier in our conversation the glimpse beyond the veil. And when we speak of Maya, we are speaking about the veil or the appearance that we believe in our life. And, Maya is generally seen as a feminine force, but it's the veil that is pulled over our eyes that keeps us from seeing our infinite nature. And that veil is intricate, it's tightly woven, but it has holes in it. And so what one experiences in a glimpse is just a certain kind of looking through the holes to see, hey, there's something beyond what I see. There's something beyond what I've come to know.
Yeah, and the yogis prescribe pratyahara as a way of beginning to approach that, which is sense withdrawal. Which speaks to the idea that we are mesmerized by the input of our physical senses, by the data coming in through our eyes and our ears and, the surfaces of our skin, etc. And because it is that which prevents us, prevents is not quite the right word. It's just a little bit like having a blindfold in the way or a curtain in the way. And it's commonly referred to as that veil, of course. And so as you go deeper into meditation and begin to become more skillful at tuning out what's coming in through your senses otherwise, then it becomes increasingly possible to see what's on the other side or what exists in the absence of that input, which is not to say that you can't have a spontaneous experience of looking through the veil or suddenly seeing something greater.
Well, you used a very peculiar word and one that I would like to elaborate on together, which is mesmerized. And it's not our senses alone that are the culprit. I mean, our senses are actually just very innocent and natural functions of a body, but there is this mesmerizing quality, or this hypnotic or sleep-inducing quality when we live our life only according to our senses. And let's talk about that a moment, because that mesmerizing quality, I love that word. It is what describes Maya, is the way of being mesmerized by our sense data.
Yeah, well, the impressions are compelling. I mean, we are, in a sense, and again, we want to maybe offer a little disclaimer here and say that we're not saying that anything that you're experiencing in third dimensional reality is quote unquote unreal or is a hallucination or is somehow utterly wrong. It is a layer of reality that is so durable that we take it to be the only one most of the time. It's the thing that persists. We go to sleep at night and it disappears for a while, and then we wake up in the morning again and it reappears. And because there is that repetition day after day, it sustains this sort of sensory narrative that continues as our lives proceed.
What we described in our last talk on non-duality was the way in which our mind perceives objects. Largely the operations of our mind is through objects, and the way we relate to objects is through our senses. And with that way of engaging life, where we are simply a sensory vehicle operating as an object with other objects, we're mesmerized by the appearance of this and that, me and other. And while that's a completely natural part of being human, it doesn't allow us to see the underlying reality, the underlying truth that isn't found in objects or the perception of them.
Yeah. I've always kind of wondered in films like, and we're going to do a whole episode on movies one of these days, but just briefly, in films like The Matrix or something like Inception, where the filmmakers are exploring this idea of there being different layers of reality that are compelling to various degrees depending on your relationship to them. Inception, in fact, with those 5 or 6 layers of dream worlds that you can go up and down through, I thought that was really interesting. And I wonder whether the filmmakers who came up with those concepts were, in fact, exploring spiritual ideas here knowingly, or whether it was just not accidental, but if that was something they intuited from deeper layers of their understanding that were perhaps not available to their conscious intention.
Well, it seems to me that that's where the collective unconscious pokes through. Is
Mm.
what we know without even knowing it, it comes through in our art and in our expressions. And movies such as The Matrix do a fine job of articulating something that we all, I mean, there's a reason why that movie was so profoundly popular and well received. And partially because there's something archaic, something, archetypal that is recognized through that film, where, here's a character who, as far as he knows, lives within the only reality there is. And yet there's this call, this poking to discover something else. And then, of course, he's invited to discover that the reality that he knows is not the reality at all, but a construct.
Right. Right. It really is sort of an awakening story in a lot of ways. And I think, that movie hit me very powerfully back when it was first released, which I think was the late 90s. We may end up doing a movie episode here unintentionally. Um, but something in me did really resonate with it because it almost accidentally answered some big questions I didn't even know I had.
Hmm.
Especially in one of the sequels where they introduced the character of the architect, who obviously is a stand-in for God. And yeah, there's just, like, as you said, it brings up and it plays with some very powerful archetypes that we don't commonly talk about. Even in our religious and spiritual practices, we don't necessarily invoke those in quite the same way as being relevant to us in an immediate sense, as something that we're experiencing right now. It seems to me that spirituality, even those of us who practice yogic techniques and are on this specific path, are sort of always deferring our enlightenment off into the future somewhere, but it's here. It's just a matter of, can you see it? Can you sort of resonate with it? Can you begin to, I don't want to use the word believe, but embody it?
Well, there's a great deal of, I don't know that this will sit well with people, but it happens to be true. There's a great deal of spiritual practice and spiritual practitioners who are simply trying to make life inside their matrix more comfortable. And,
Mm,
while that's perfectly understandable for a person who's experiencing suffering and difficulty and struggle, we don't necessarily grasp that our spiritual practices aren't ultimately to allow us to feel more comfortable with Maya or with the illusory construct of life that we have created for ourselves, but they are in fact an invitation to pierce the veil, to move
yeah.
through the construct, and to actually discover what's real, what's true. And that takes heart, and that takes courage, because it is not an easy thing to deconstruct the stories, the narratives, the mental fabric of our lives that piece together our idea and version of reality,
Right.
to deconstruct that and find what's really real, what's really true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ego doesn't like that at all.
No.
Ego is like the guy in the Matrix. I forget his name now, the character's name, but who has been outside the Matrix and then ultimately comes back. Spoiler alerts for anybody who hasn't seen that movie in the last 20 years. But he ultimately decides that it's not what he wants. He wants to go back to that comfort, go back to being somebody, being a big shot in the quote unquote, well, in the Matrix, I guess, in not the real world, and he doesn't want to fight anymore. And he's like, I don't want to remember any of it, and I want to be able to eat steaks again and think that they're real. And I don't know how common that is, but I suspect there are people whose egos will at some point simply put the brakes on and say, no, we're not going any farther. We like our comfy little physical existence.
Yes. Well, Maya, if we'll call her that, or him that, or it that, that force which veils us keeps us very entrenched within these very animalistic quests to be secure, to be
Yeah.
comfortable, to experience pleasure, to feel a bit of power or reputation or fame. And you're describing that character Cypher from
Oh, yeah.
Matrix, and he wants to go back to sleep.
Yeah.
He doesn't want the struggle of being awake anymore. He wants to
Right.
go back to a life of ignorance and pleasure. And of course, that's within one's choosing. One can do that.
Mhm.
One can
Right.
choose to live this life in pursuit of pleasure. But the cost of that is deep, because to live a life of Maya is to live a life where we lose meaning. We lose a sense of what our true nature is, what true unity and connection are. And so as much as we can understand a life that's designed for comfort and pleasure, it's not a real life. It's not a truly, it's not a life well lived.
And it's not a durable life. And I maybe think that's one way that we can point to Maya, is by saying that Maya always changes. None of it is permanent. So your name, your status, your physical body, all of the things that you draw pleasure from will ultimately pass away. And so, not that there's anything wrong with enjoying those things in the moment, but if you invest your sense of security there, if you invest your sense of meaning there, as you were saying, then ultimately you're just deferring suffering,
Yes.
which is a whole other topic.
Well, practically, we can ask the question, what are you living for? What's your life for? And if it's a life that's lived purely for pleasure or comfort or security or a little bit of fame and recognition and being liked, then, in the end, that's cheap. And in the end, it feels that we've sacrificed something so profound in pursuit of those things. And that's the trance. That's the mesmerized quality of Maya. What keeps us in the quest for these things that not only change, but are ultimately carry no satisfaction in them.
Right, right. Because if you're taking your sense of meaning or your sense of self-worth from other people's opinions of you, that can change on a dime. If you're invested in your healthy body, say, maybe you spend all your time at the gym and that makes you feel powerful and meaningful and superior, then it just takes one bad car wreck or severe illness to take that away from you. So it's a tenuous place to be in, even though it can feel, I'm sure, if you're Beyonce or somebody, and I love Beyonce like everybody, that's got to be a pretty heady and powerful experience, but I'm going to guess that she keeps herself pretty well grounded in order to cope with that. Let's not talk about Beyonce. But what I was trying to express was the idea that you can be rich, you can have power and fame, and none of it lasts. And ultimately, it means that you have invested your sense of permanence in things outside of yourself, things that aren't real. Other people's opinions, those are ephemeral, as we all know. You can be loved today and be sort of kicked off the top of the mountain tomorrow. I don't know, who would want that?
That's, in the yogic tradition, the word sat is often used to denote reality or being, and it's usually described as that which doesn't change. And
Yeah.
if we can contrast that which doesn't change with everything which does, and let's say for a moment that Maya is all that changes. If we look at our human experience, we won't find anything that doesn't change. And yet there is this call of the underlying sat, the underlying reality of the beingness, which doesn't come and go, which doesn't change. And when we seek that, when we seek to live our life as an embodiment of that, we're no longer mesmerized by these fleeting aspects of our experience.
Yeah. And the tricky part about that, I think, we talked about that a little bit in the last episode, is the way that plucks you out of the circus, or sort of that melee of human activity. Well, we talk about being in the world, but not of it. You become much more of an observer moving through it as it, and less of someone who's taking yourself so seriously and operating from that very egoic perspective.
Yeah, beautifully put. We're less a character in the play and more the whole play itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Ramana Maharshi was asked one time to describe what Maya is, and he gave the most basic definition I've ever heard. He said, Maya is that which is not. If we were to just look at that statement for a moment, Maya is that which is not, and really examine what that might mean for our lives, to see where the narratives, the stories, the dramas that we play out in our lives are not necessarily real, but instead they are constructs that we play out mentally, and then obviously we act them out in our physical life too, but to understand the role of these non-existent mental structures that we obey and play out in our life is to understand that Maya is a force. It's a preoccupation with what is not real,
Yeah.
what doesn't have substance or reality, and ultimately when we see its nature, it's empty.
Yeah.
There's nothing to it.
So, how does a person move through the world with this understanding? How do you continue to be? I've had people to say to me, well, how do you get anything done if you don't have an ego? Do you see what I'm saying? Coming
Yeah.
from a perspective of being somebody, being an identity, having a job, having a family, and to not lose those things necessarily, but to release your psychological attachments to their meaning, to their, here we go with language again.
Hmm. I think I understand what you're getting at here, which is, what is a life when it's not guided by the drive for security, pleasure, and power?
Yeah,
And,
and
and
glory. Yeah. Where do you find
right.
your glory if you're not going to be taking it from this Mayic experience? Is
Yeah.
that a
Well,
word? Is Mayic a word?
well, you just made it
I just
one.
made it up.
That's the question that no ego can reconcile, because a life for the ego, for the separate self, a life that is not designed for security, pleasure, and power is not a life worth living. And until we have a glimpse or an understanding of the possibility of living a life that is richer, deeper, and more meaningful than those drives, we simply can't conceive of how we might live in the world. But
Yeah.
to live in this world with that knowledge, that true knowing, is to live a life of service. And it's to live a life where the goal, if you will, is to be an embodiment of the one, and to serve that, to facilitate that recognition and understanding in those that you encounter. And it's not a life of personal glory. It's not a life of security, pleasure, and power. It's just the opposite. It's a life of deep service.
Right, right. Which explains why the saints have tended to be so humble and so willing to simply disappear and not allow themselves to be glorified because they knew how meaningless that was.
Yeah, well, glorification of the self, the separate self, is no different than it's idolatry.
Mm,
Anything that is placed on high it turns into idolatry, and the truly wise ones know that, not only of themselves but of anything in existence. And where
yeah,
that idolatry is part of the scheme of our egoic consciousness playing itself
right,
out.
right. So the question that maybe follows that is, so why is there Maya? If Maya is the context in which we are experiencing this reality, then why? Why did God give us this playground to express ourselves in which we would be ultimately disappointed by it?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I would say that God didn't give a playground. God gave a classroom.
Hmm.
And Maya is our confusion in thinking that this is a playground rather than a classroom. And it's a delusional attempt to make ourselves comfortable. It's like trying to travel to a place that's not your home and pretend that it's your home. And there's all sorts of reasons to do that. But this is where I think Ramana's definition is so important, is that Maya is that which is not. And I would say that Maya is not created by God, because there is, in essence, this is where it gets really esoteric to speak about. There is no Maya, actually. There's only the appearance. There's only, just as we might look at a mirage and we see something that appears to be water, but isn't.
Mm.
So if we ask, well, why did God create the water? God didn't. There isn't water there.
Well, a lot of people who object to that statement, but I know what you're talking about. But
Object to what statement?
that there is no water, that it's all a mirage. But if we hearken back to our previous discussion on non-duality, then really what we're talking about is the fact that this is all a dream in the mind of God, that we're all players or thoughts or dream characters.
Well, the mistake that is sometimes made in speaking about Maya is, when we refer to Maya as illusion, and we refer to the world we live in as illusion, we're not saying that this life we live is a hallucination. We're not trying to characterize it as something that doesn't exist. What we're attempting to do is we're attempting to reach our understanding to see that there is a faulty premise within our story of what
Mm.
life is.
Mm-hmm.
And life is, we can experience life with our senses, and that's real. That's real. It's not a hallucination, but the mental construct that we use to say, this is who I am, this is what life is, this is the purpose of life, this is the meaning of life, those constitute the illusion. And as that illusion breaks down, we begin to have an awareness that there is a deeper impulse, a richer impulse to life than what we have made of it based on our cultural values, familial values, our own personal desires for, security, pleasure, power. And to me, that's what's really useful in understanding Maya, is not that we walk around within a hallucination, but that the life we've constructed for ourselves doesn't constitute our real
Mm.
life, our real existence.
Right. I want to maybe qualify something there, though, because there is definitely, once you're aware of Maya and you have perhaps glimpsed through it, there is a distinct shift in perception that happens. And I've heard you describe it in the past as watching life go by like a movie,
Mm.
perhaps. Um, when that shift happens, there's a way in which it's not that your perceptions become less real, but the meanings you once attached to them become completely irrelevant. And the freedom that comes out of that is that you develop this ability to stay in a moment and simply watch what arrives, to kind of watch what's unfolding without trying to predict where it's going to go, or without trying to extrapolate something from the past to then, pin it down and make it mean something. It becomes this very free flowing, it's like it's just being in a river and seeing where it takes you. And so, lest anybody think that seeing through the illusion somehow makes it more boring, there's actually, as you say, a much richer understanding and experience of it that arrives out of, there's kind of a miraculousness that occurs, if that makes sense.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, that's the point, isn't it? That
Mm.
this glimpse beyond the veil it will reveal the dreamlike nature of life, and the cinema of life, the drama that we are here partaking in. And if we're left asking, then what's the point? There's something that we've failed to see, and it's that the world isn't out there, that the world is inside of you. And with that understanding, a profound shift occurs, because when you believe that life is outside of you, you're mesmerized.
Yeah.
When you understand that life and the world are inside you, it's a completely different life you live then. You realize not only the dreamlike nature of reality as you encounter it, but you also recognize who the dreamer is.
Yeah. And who contains the dream? Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Much of our conception, much of our idea of Maya hinges upon this idea that there is a world out there. And even with a very basic investigation into how we experience the world, our entire experience of the world happens within our own perception. And to understand that alone is to begin to understand, or to begin to glimpse through the veil of Maya.
Do you happen to have a poem?
Yeah, I have one.
Excellent.
Yeah. I like this poem. I've always liked it since I first read it, and it's by the mystic Kabir. And what I like about this poem is, in a way, is he's speaking as that voice to beckon you to look through, or to glimpse past the veil. So he's actually that invitation to move through the veil.
Mm.
Are you looking for me? I am in the next seat. My shoulder is against yours. You will not find me in the stupas, not in Indian shrine rooms, nor in synagogues, nor cathedrals. You will not find me in masses, nor kirtans, not in legs wound around your neck, not by eating nothing but vegetables. When you really look for me, you will see me instantly. You will find me in the tiniest house of time. So tell me, what is God? He is the breath inside the breath.
Mm. I like Kabir.
Yeah, he's brilliant. Thanks for listening to this episode of Into the Mystery. We hope you gained something useful. If you'd like to learn more about our work, you can go to our websites. Mine is at adivajra.org, adivajra.org, or visit Rishika's at interdimensionalyoga.com. If you have questions or topics you'd like to hear about in future episodes, be sure to drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.